Born and educated in New York, Peter settled in Berkshire County in 1990 and has served for 2 years on the Richmond Cultural Council and 6 years on the Pittsfield Cultural Council, as well as 2 additional years in Boston. He was a member of the founding board of the Berkshire Stonewall Community Coalition, the Berkshire Writers' Room, and Art of the Game. He was a member of the Berkshire Art Association Board and has been an advisor in the arts to 5 mayors. His series of plays dealing with Pittsfield history have all been record-breaking hits in unconventional venues in their off-season winter presentations. His most recent play, Dream Awake, was presented at the Whitney Center for the Arts in Pittsfield and developed by the Berkshire Playwrights Lab in Great Barrington in 2019. He has written for the Berkshire Eagle, the Independent, the Advocate, the Chatham Courier, Bravo, Bay Windows, and other newspapers and magazines around the country, including audiobookscafe.com and Playbill. He has been a published theater critic since the age of 14, and he claims Jack the Ripper as a relative. His blog, Berkshire Bright Focus, covers theater in Berkshire County, Vermont, Connecticut, and New York and Massachusetts within driving distance. He's the president of the Berkshire Theater Critics Association, which each year awards, gives award for the best theater work in the area. And it's with great pleasure that I introduce Peter.
All right, well, thank you both very much. Sally, thank you for the introduction. I should say that the Berkshire Theater region, as we describe it at the Berkshire Theater Critics Association, is everything in Berkshire County and within 30 miles of our border. So we cover a fairly large area in Vermont. Clearly, Bennington falls into that group, as does Dorset and Weston and a few other places. And we have a large enough and wide enough group of critics who are members that we get decent coverage from Vermont and from the Capital District in New York State and out to Schenectady and down into Connecticut to New Haven, not New Haven, Hartford, down to Hartford and out into the Pioneer Valley, which gives us a lot of theater to cover. The biggest problem this year is we stopped covering theater for the most part in March, when everything was sort of shut down. Theater in the time of pandemic has been quite a challenge, and it challenges not just theater professionals, but everyone associated with the theaters. You can't do theater in any town or city in our region without calling on local businesses for help, without spending money in local businesses. And I think, from what I gather from everybody I've talked with, it's been a time of suffering with the loss of theater. This summer, in particular, in the summer, as Sally and her husband know, I cover between 130 and 176 shows every year, which is a lot. But this year, it's basically been a dozen at most. Our season, the Berkshire Theater Critics season, begins in October and ends at the end of September. That's because we normally give our awards in November, early November, and we need the month to do all of the assembly of information and all the voting and the tallying of the votes and the ordering of the awards and doing press. So from October of last year until the end of February, there were still quite a few shows regionally to see. And I'm glad for that. Unfortunately, we are canceling our awards ceremony this year because 90% of what we would normally cover was not available. And with only a handful of shows, it's hard to give this kind of an award. And I'm sorry about that, because I think it means a lot to the theaters and to the people involved who get nominated to get that kind of visibility. So it's a big it's a big sort of tragedy for us. I'm wearing a t-shirt, by the way, that says, official member of the Piss and Moan About Everything Club, which is pretty much the job of a critic. We need to be serious about the work that we do. We need to be honest about the work that we do, which is sometimes difficult. I have been known for many, many years by most of my associates as the nice one. I tend to find things that are positive about almost every experience, something good to say, something to recommend. But on 3 occasions, 2 of them at Williamstown Theater, I've been particularly harsh and unforgiving about what's been delivered to the public. After the first really bad review I wrote of one of their pieces, the then producer, Jenny Gersten, went to my publisher and asked that I be removed as a critic and fired from the newspaper. That didn't happen. After the second one, well, there was an uproar. I write for an organization in Great Barrington. It's a daily online newspaper called the BerkshireEdge.com. And after the review of that play came out, they had over 1,800 emails condemning me. I felt kind of good about that, knowing that I had at least 1,800 followers, people who were reading me. But it was harsh, it was difficult. I faced a lot of threats, actually. Like 2 people threatened to find me and to disembowel me, which is one of the best things any critic can ever say about his work, that he has affected that many people to that degree. I think Walter Kerr is the only other one I know of who ever got that much animosity from a readership. But luckily that didn't last, and I still have everything I was born with. But the thing about what's going on now, when Broadway shut down in March, it was a national tragedy. So much money is generated by the Broadway stage. So much interest is given to it, nationally and internationally. And it provides for the city of New York so much revenue. It's not just the actors who are put out of work when a show closes. It's the producers, the designers, the stage management people, the people who stand out in the audience and hand out programs and point you to your seat. The hotels are affected. The restaurants are affected. Gift shops are affected. Shopping in general is affected from people who are no longer coming into your city, into New York or Pittsfield or Bennington, who are spending money. It's a big, big financial loss. It also affects what regional theaters and amateur theaters and other theater groups, schools can do, because there's less and less new original product available for people to produce on their own. It also takes away in the school setting, because one of the best things our schools are able to do is to provide an access to the arts, whether it be in a classroom structure or going to a play or producing a play on their own stage. It takes away from the broader cultural aspect of everyone's life, and especially students. Students need to be exposed to music and visual art and theater and poetry and literature. As a novelist, having just won a major national award, all of my speaking engagements, all of my reading engagements, all of my book signings were canceled. My income has diminished from a decent living to something close to, if I hadn't had any savings, poverty, because I get paid for every review that I write. At the height of my reviewing schedule, about 8-9 years ago, I was syndicated in 9 different markets, each of them paying me for my work. Now I'm reduced to 2, one that doesn't pay me anything and one that pays me a small amount per review. I like to tell the story that when I was 14 and started reviewing professionally, I was paid $25 a review. That was back in 1962, a long time ago. And $25 in 1962 was not so bad. I was also 14 years old, so it was a really good income for a 14-year-old. When I had my last major newspaper gig here in the Berkshires, writing for The Advocate, which was published in North Adams and reached into Bennington and throughout Berkshire County and over into Columbia County in New York State, I was still being paid $25 a review. This is hardly a career choice for most people. It certainly wasn't great, but that $25 was supplemented by 7 other outlets. So it wasn't so bad after all. But we're really looking at a situation that is uncomfortable and unpleasant. There seems to be little hope for restoration of active theater life this winter or spring. Hopefully next summer there will be some. But until then, it's pretty dire. I have a lot of actor friends in New York. Most of them had regular part-time gigs for when they were not working in a stage production or doing a television show or filming a movie. They would do office work. But with this pandemic, so many offices either closed or reduced the size of their staffs, so even their backup work disappeared. I'm not sure how most of them are surviving. I talked to one friend just this week who has a gig that he's worked for about 15 years, but instead of 5 days a week, he's only employed half days on 2 days a week, which has reduced his other income immensely. The nice thing about that particular job for him was that he was able to take time as a half-time employee to go and do auditions, but now he can't even do that. It's dire and it's only going to get worse. There have been options. There are not many of them, but there have been options. A lot of online presentation. One theater over in New York State showed 5 filmed stage productions that they had done. The films were for their own use. They were not supposed to ever be shown publicly, but permission was given for them to show the films on Zoom. They could not charge for them, however, but at least they kept their audience engaged. Bennington's been doing some interesting sort of marginal theatrical material being shown in much the same way. Not productions, but discussions and lectures and a few other things. And there's been a fair amount of that actually going on. But our region, our Berkshire region, had the great distinction of being the only location in America that was granted permission to do live stage productions at both Berkshire Theater Group and Barrington Stage Company. Barrington Stage Company, in preparation for this, and they worked diligently with Actors Equity Association and the other unions to get all the permissions they needed to do this. They basically took their principal theater, their major theater, the Boyd Quinson stage, and they wrecked it. They took out more than half the seats. They redid their air conditioning system completely so that clean air could be supplied, the theater could be cleaned between performances. They reconfigured their lobby and their entrances so that people were never packed in. And then, 2 weeks before opening, Governor Baker here in Massachusetts declared that no indoor performances were going to be permitted under any circumstances. They had to then go and find a location for a tent, get a tent, redesign the 2 shows that they were going to be able to do, and present them to only 100 people per performance. down from 145 people in the indoor space that they had redesigned and altered. But when indoor was banned and they were reduced to 100, it changed everything. They didn't change their prices. They maintained them at their usual mid-level. But then, the day they opened, the governor declared that they could only have 50 people total in the performance space, including performers. Their first show was a one-man show. Crew consisted of one costume person, one lighting person, and the stage manager. That meant 46 people could be allowed in the audience. For Berkshire Theater Group, who did a production of Godspell with 8 performers and 3 musicians, a stage manager, and a lighting person to run the show, they were reduced from 50 down to 38 people in the audience. They did run for over a month, so I think they did reasonably well, but it's difficult. And what they did with Godspell, I think, is very interesting. They rewrote the opening so that each of the performers could introduce him or herself and tell us out in the audience what they have gone through in this period of pandemic. It was moving, it was dynamic, it was one of the best things I think I've ever seen a theater do. And I am one of those people who really detests Godspell. I've never liked it from the beginning to now. But this production had such a personal sensibility and such a dynamic presentation that I literally fell in love with the production of the show. Those 2 shows were augmented by a third at Barrington Stage Company's outdoor tent venue, which was a Rodgers and Hammerstein concert. It was nicely done. It was very nicely done. But it didn't require equity permission because it came in under a different kind of contract. But still, the restrictions persisted that the state had put on public performance. So they charged more. They needed to in order to be able to pay the performers. The theaters themselves did not make money this summer, but they were the only 2 in the entire nation given permission to do equity-approved shows. That means that they could hire professional actors, people who were union members, the kind of performers we look forward to throughout the region, joining our non-professional or semi-professional, as they like to be called, performers who are not union members, but who work quite often in the theater. What will happen next year is hard to say. Barrington Stage Company was scheduled to do a production of Arthur Miller's play, The Price, a 4-character play set in an attic. Julianne Boyd, the director, said that she thought it would be a good fit for this period of time because the 4 people detest one another and never come close. So they could direct it in a way that maintained that 6-foot distance on stage and have it make sense. I don't know if they're going to physically be able to do it. I haven't heard what the status is of that. But chances are, if they do, it will be interesting to see it staged in a way that keeps 3 members of a family at literally arm's length. They are going to be doing, and in fact, it's starting, it has started, I think it started 2 nights ago, a streamed online reading of a play called 3 Viewings, starring 2 television stars, one of whom has done a lot of theater work up here, Deborah Jo Rupp. She and her 70s show co-star Kurtwood Smith are doing that play. They're asking for a donation of $25 per viewing. It's an interesting concept. It's one of the few full plays that I will have had a chance to see. online. I probably will review it. I was thinking of trying to see it tonight, but I unfortunately have a conflict. Even now, in time of pandemic, I have conflicts in scheduling. But it's amazing how many people, how many theaters are trying desperately to do something. I just heard, or actually read today in the Berkshire Eagle, of a company in Miami Beach, Florida, that's doing a new work called The Seven Deadly Sins. There have been so many Seven Deadly Sins shows over the years. They're doing it in 7 different plays in storefront windows on the street. I didn't know that Miami Beach had that many open and available storefronts. I'm kind of surprised. And you get your ticket and you kind of wander the city and see the 7 shows. It's wonderful how inventive people in the arts can be. But it's also unfortunate that there have to be so many ways of doing things, so many different points of view. I was talking with a couple of colleagues last week, and we were talking about what theater will be like when it's finally permitted once again. And it's really hard to know. Will it go back to being what it's always been, or will it transform into something new and something different? Productions will most likely have to be smaller for a while because there's such a great amount of financial loss going on this year, and probably through some of next year, maybe all of next year. The Met, the Metropolitan Opera, just yesterday canceled its entire 2021 season. And that affects so many people internationally, musicians, designers, directors, singers, who will not have the employment they've been looking forward to, and most have been contracted for 2 or 3 years in advance. And suddenly it's at a loss. And if somebody is doing something somewhere else and they're available, they may not be hired because those companies also book people in advance to get the big names. So it's hard to gauge. The Met has a resident orchestra and a resident chorus, and they are paid whether they perform or not because they have a contract that provides them with a weekly income. That's gone. The overwhelming aspect of what this pandemic has done is really kind of hard to talk about, hard to gauge, because how many bar mitzvahs and weddings are going to be hiring dance bands when you can't have more than 50 people assembled for an event, or 100 people in some places. But even so, are people going to want to dance? Is that kind of activity going to be able to come back? To be in someone's arms on a crowded dance floor does not seem like a real possibility for the near future. There's a company called Shakespeare at Home, and they're doing The Tempest as a radio play. And they're doing it in 4 episodes, which means the play is being broken down, the 5-act play is being broken down into 4 transformable acts to be heard a week apart. Will that be enough to engage people to come back every week? Will real theater enthusiasts find that appealing? It's hard to know. But I have to applaud all of the theater companies that are doing what they can do to engage an audience, to keep an audience involved and interested. Everyone's asking for donations. If I could give a donation to every theater I covered, I would have to be a very rich man, which, as I said, at $25 a review is not going to happen. So, the prospect for the future, unknown. The prospect for the immediate future, kind of drizzled with interesting things if you can do it. There's a small theater company called The Two of Us Productions in New York State that has moved from doing almost bare stage presentations which was all they could afford, to doing readings of mystery plays. They do a very nice job with them, but their readings, the people are not together. They're like we are, each of us in our own space, corresponding as we can, conversing as we might. But theatrically, it's not enthralling, at least not for me. Maybe because I've been doing this for so long. But I look forward to the future. I hope that we can come back from this, that theater can be restored to us and for us and maybe with us. But it's really hard to say. Do you have any questions?
One thing, I don't know if you'd seen yesterday's New York Times, but it's an article called New York's Arts Shutdown, Economic Crisis in One Lost Weekend. And just to throw some interesting numbers out there, they're estimating $120 billion as what arts contribute to the New York State economy. It's 7.5% of the economic output of the state. So a lot of people think, oh, arts is an accessory or it's a luxury. But when you start talking, $120 billion is not chump change, and 7.5% of the economy is a drastically significant chunk if it is essentially removed. So I think it's important to keep that in perspective, that
absolutely
essential, not a luxury.
What a lot of people forget is the term show business is not a joke. It's a business, and it does produce a major income, not just for itself, but for all of these supporting factors and supporting factions and businesses. That's a big loss. Thank you for bringing that to our attention.
I think Jerry or Mary Lou, you had a question? Okay.
Peter, one of the
Brian as well.
One of the reasons we've only lived here full time now for 7 years, and one of the reasons we moved to this area was the arts, the theater and arts, and it's been tough to not have that. And some of the things that you brought up, we don't think about so much. From New York City all the way up to here, certainly it's commendable that some have tried, and I think you're quite right that the arts are very innovative. If something can be done, they'll try to find a way to do it.
Exactly.
Brian, did you have a question?
Peter, I appreciate the whole presentation, and I know that this wasn't the crux to what you were talking about, but you mentioned there were only 3 times that you wrote, a negative review, and I was just kind of curious, what was it? Was there a theme across all 3 of those, or what was it that it actually took to get you to write a negative review?
Well, thank you for asking. The rationale for each of them is very different from one another. The first one was a production of Hedda Gabler in Hudson, New York. It was done in a theater space above a bar. The director, who was touted as one of the young geniuses and upcoming geniuses of the regional theater, was crazy as can be. He turned, if you're familiar with the story of Hedda Gabler, she is a wife who has some psychosexual problems, including a relationship with a former lover. The lover returns in the play. And this Hedda was directed to be physically sexual with every other character in the play, including her husband's great aunt. And when she wasn't being sexual with all of these people, he had her sitting in a small waiting pool downstage right, splashing cold water on herself. It was the most ridiculous interpretation of Hedda Gabler I've ever seen. He also had the same actor play her husband and her lover. And the lover wore a Phantom of the Opera mask to distinguish himself from the husband. In the middle of the last act, the bartender arrived and began dispersing ice into the cooler. And for me, it was the high point of the play. It was, without a doubt, the worst interpretation I've ever seen of anything. That was the first one that got a bad review from me. But I will say this, when the review came out, there was such a clamor for tickets because people could not believe this, that they had to extend the run for 2 weeks. So a bad review isn't always a bad thing. The first bad review at Williamstown was for a musical called 10 Cents a Dance, which had been touted as a glorious review of the songs of Rodgers and Hart. A beautiful show, optimistic, sweet, romantic, and lovely. And it was the darkest, most distressing show I've ever seen. Donna McKechnie was one of the two stars. Donna, who does not play an instrument, was given a triangle to play because every other actor played an instrument in the show. And she played it badly. She wasn't given a single song to sing or a dance to do, and that's what she's known for. She was a dancer, a brilliant dancer, the star of Company. Not Company, Chorus Line, excuse me. It got a very bad review. People walked out. I had to keep standing up to let people out of my row. And when I mentioned that in the review, the producer was incensed. She said, nobody left. They went to standing room so that they could dance to the music, which was just a total lie. The third one was just 2 years ago, I think, was a version of Chekhov's The Three Sisters called Moscow, 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 Moscow. And if you think that's a boring title, it pretty much exemplifies what the show was. And so those are the three shows that I wrote totally bad reviews about. And that's the one that got me the 1,800 emails threatening me. So I hope that's a reasonable explanation.
Thank you very much.
Peter, I have to apologize to you. I know you've had some funny comments in there, and since have had everybody muted, you haven't had any feedback on some of those. So my apologies.
Well, thank you. Anybody else have a question or a comment? I'm open for everything.
I got one comment. I said, Peter, as much as you've been threatened and everything about your reviews, you've never been bitten by a dog.
I have been, but not for my reviews.
Sorry, Mike.
That's all right. It was a long time ago.
Sally, you're going to have to unmute if you want to say something. Sally? Mike, can you unmute Sally?
I cannot actually, the way things are changed in the program.
Okay, I've unmuted myself. I just wanted to say that I saw 2 of the plays that he reviewed badly, and he was so right. I think 10 Cents a Dance was one of the most agonizing nights in theater, and Moscow, Moscow, one of the most boring. You were on target, as you always are, Peter.
Thank you, Sally. I don't mean to sound totally pessimistic about the future of theater. I just have no idea what it's going to be or when.
It will survive.
It always has. Oscar Hammerstein, back in early 1950s, wrote a lyric which went, the theater is dying, the theater is dying, the theater is totally dead. And that was for a big musical, which had a decent run. It wasn't a great show, but it had a decent run. But that kind of concept shows up every 25 years or so. This time it's a little bit different. It's not being killed from within, it's being killed from without. And that's the big difference here.
Peter, you're a novelist. What are you working on in terms of writing?
Thank you for asking. I'm currently, at the request of a friend of mine, working on a memoir. You see the mess of papers and books and things behind me because I'm sorting out my life. I just finished a stack of newspaper articles about that high. And I'm also working on a new novel, a historical novel about 4 women who were at the early part of the 20th century, major factors in art and literature and early radio, and how their lives intersected and affected one another.
Sounds fascinating.
I hope it will be.
What are their names?
Well, one of them was Edna St. Vincent Millay, without whom you cannot address the early part of the 20th century. One of them is the woman who invented the Kewpie, a wonderful artist and poet whose name just flew right out of my head when you asked. And I'm stalling for time trying to get it back. That's one of the things about being in my 70s now. Things fly out of my head.
You're not alone.
But she invented the Kewpie as an illustration for a poem, and it became not just a literary revolution because she used the Kewpies in so many things, but also the invention of the Kewpie doll by a German company, and she herself supported a lot of artists. So it's an interesting concept. I hope it's a good book. I've been working on it for far too long, but I'm nearing the end.
Ooh, exciting.
It is, thank you. I'm also working on, I just wrote my first political play ever, and I have it out with a bunch of theaters that are supposedly reading it, but nobody's called me. And the play that was done in November that Sally mentioned in my introduction, Dream Awake, was scheduled for a production which has been canceled, partly because the play requires so much physical intimacy that it's too dangerous a piece to try to produce at this point. 2 of the 3 main characters spend a lot of time in bed. The third one, a psychiatrist, is unfortunately much in need of physical contact with both the husband and the wife. So that's been put off. I don't know if it'll ever come back. But again, it's theater. You never know. I look at life as theater. It's just a theater without a producer you can telephone. Ask for changes.
Being a retired minister, maybe this is about prayer.
You know, a prayer, I think, is a theatrical gimmick. It works brilliantly, but it is a theatrical gimmick, whether it's prayer out loud or silent prayer. Getting your head into the role that you're playing in life and trying to see how it can affect your entire life, the people around you, people you don't know. I'm heavily praying in what I have to call monologues at this point over the upcoming election.
Yes.
See if it works.
If
I'm happy with the outcome, I may actually claim credit.
On that note, thank you, Peter, for
yes, thank you.
with us today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.